Gloucester History Festival.
Beams and the Blackfriars were donated by Henry III. And
I mean, there's so much great stuff that goes on here. If anyone's not been to Gloucester History Festival...
The Gloucester History Festival special series on History with Jackson.
Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. Today, we're joined by author and historian Luke Pepera to discuss his fantastic new book, Motherland, A Journey Through 500,000 Years of African Culture and Identity. How you doing, Luke?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on, Jackson.
Oh, no worries at all. I'm really excited to get stuck into talking about your book and talking about some of your work.
Yeah, no, me too. Yeah, it's an honor to be, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here and to be talking about Motherland as well. So yeah, looking forward to getting stuck in.
Oh, awesome. Well, in the interest of getting stuck in then, the first question, it's a bit of a cliche question for the author, but what inspired you to write this book?
So I was basically just concerned with the fact that there was so little history to do with Africa that went beyond the last 300 years of slavery and colonization. I mean, for this book, my whole, what I do generally in terms of my writing and my research and my storytelling is to really fill out the gaps in for the rest of the African past, everything that moves beyond these last 300 years that a lot of TV documentaries, books, etc. tend to focus on. And then for this book, and when it comes to this book specifically, it was also related to that. I was I was 16, 17. Last year of school or second last year, and I was doing this personal project, and I wanted to do it on one of the ethnic groups I belong to, the Kwewu, and that's because I'd been interested in history, anthropology, people, migration, movement. So I thought it'd be interesting to trace the movement of my own ancestors. And then I'm originally from Ghana, and I spent a lot of time there, and that's where I wanted to do a little bit of research. And where I went first was the National Museum of Ghana, and as I was looking around, hoping to find some stuff on sort of historic Ghanaian peoples and indigenous peoples, and what they did and practiced and believed, I ended up finding mostly slavery era and colonial era related artifacts. And the museum is expanded now, thankfully, but then that's mostly what I saw. And I knew there was a lot more to the history of all the peoples that inhabited not just Ghana but Africa more generally. Having met people from different parts and traveled to different parts, and even from being from Ghana myself, I'd been exposed to a lot of just a lot of cultural things, songs, stories, music, dances, masks, myths and legends, and there's just a lot of material there. So I was wondering why that only really, especially when it came to the artifacts in the museum and telling the story of people in Ghana, this was the history we were focusing on. So that motivated me to learn a little bit more, and then through that I ended up studying archaeology and anthropology at university, and then did a module on ancient and medieval African history, and that's when I was fully exposed to the depth and the richness and the variety of that history. And that early inspiration and that early knowledge all went into doing this book. So that's like a really, really early incarnation. And then obviously it took a little while to actually get the book itself, done and out there, and to get it commissioned, and to find my way through publishing, etc. But if I was to think about the original inspiration and the roots of what I'm doing more generally, and then over this project specifically, the book Motherland, that's really where it came from.
Really like how you were able to link your own academic interest to kind of your heritage, your work at school as well. I think that's what we often underestimate that as historians, that how much of an impact our schoolwork and EPQs have on ourselves as a historian.
Yeah, it's funny because I think the reason you call them EPQs, the extended project qualification, makes me think we're probably at school around the same time. Exactly what I was talking about. Most people, I'm like, do they even do those anymore? But no, you're absolutely right. It has like a really long, it has a long tail. And, even the reason I decided to do that project is because I have these, these general interests in, I mean, mythology was big for me. Initially it was Greek and Roman, but then, as I was, engaged more with my, my African heritage and visiting Ghana, that became more of a feature, the myths and the legends, and then obviously also the history of that itself, and then broadening out to Africa more generally, and then writing and storytelling as well, English and literature being a really big part, or huge passions for me. So it was a way to kind of combine all those interests, and that's sort of the path that I've followed, and it's culminated in the career that I have, and then obviously in the book as well, more specifically.
You mentioned really a couple of really cool things within that answer, and I could tell a Percy Jackson reader whenever I come across one there. But then you mentioned religion.
Yeah.
You mentioned religion, and often, we have there's this idea that Africa can be quite Christian or Islamic in the north, but there's a rich history of, different religions and different cultures. And I noticed within the book that quite a lot of these cultures and religions have a huge amount of crossover in their beliefs, and the way that they worship. Could you let us know about some of these religions?
Yes, so I think probably the foundation of a lot of African belief systems is the ancestors and our relationship with the ancestors. These are people who've lived, they've lived and died essentially, but they're also people who, when they live, they accomplished extraordinary feats, and therefore they become almost the role models of a particular culture and a particular society. And just because they've died, in other words, and this is really the crux of it when it comes to African belief, where we consider dying not, the end of anything, or any kind of, ceasing to exist, but actually all it is a transformation, a transmutation from living in the mortal world, that's the world that we are all in now, to the spirit world, which is mostly invisible to people who live in the mortal world. So when people die, they move on from this mortal world to that spirit world where they continue to exist, and it is possible still to be in contact with peoples who've moved on. And one of these people more generally are known as the living dead, and the ancestors form part of that. They're the ones who've accomplished the most. And one of the things that African peoples do quite generally is to we engage with our ancestors. They're the people who probably engage with most, and that's obviously that's usually for advice or protection or for blessings. And obviously, if we and the way in which we interact with them is usually through various rituals. Sometimes actually some African peoples will communicate with their ancestors directly, almost as if they're having a conversation with someone who's also living in the mortal world. But often that communication comes in the form of what we call veneration, which is just remembering and doing acts that demonstrate our respect for the ancestors. So it could be building shrines to them or leaving various offerings, etc. And that's how we maintain our relationship with them. And in maintaining that relationship, we gain their advice and blessings and protection. And if we don't maintain that, then they withdraw their protection, and it means that we suffer various misfortunes in life. So that's really the foundation of a lot of African belief systems, is that relationship. And I mean, you mentioned the world religions, Christianity and Islam. I mean, Christianity, especially with the exception really of Ethiopia, Northeast Africa, Christianity and a lot of it, especially West Africa, where it's it's a big religion. It's quite recent. It's really an 18th century, 19th century thing. I mean, you do have it as well in West Central, in places like Angola, where the Portuguese were there earlier, which is Catholicism, and that dates a little bit earlier to mainly the 17th century, I would say. But even when you had world religions penetrating Africa, I mean, Islam is probably the oldest, especially in parts of East and West Africa. But there are on the Swahili coast, Islam has been present there since the 8th century, which is remarkably early, given that the expansion of Islam really only comes in the 7th century. And then obviously in West Africa as well, it's also pretty early, like the 9th, 10th centuries AD, and one of the significant empires there, empires in the Middle Ages, Mali, which reaches its height in the 14th century, is Muslim, but that's really only the big part, the Swahili coast, and then Mali, and actually the rest of Islam doesn't really penetrate beyond that. It doesn't penetrate to Central Africa, whereabouts where like Zimbabwe now is, and it doesn't also penetrate to the coast. Islam, in the early Middle Ages, to where Ghana and Nigeria and Burkina Faso, etc., Cote d'Ivoire, etc., are. But even in those societies, in those situations where you have a world religion, it tends to remain usually at the elite level. So in Mali and across the Swahili coast, it's mainly the rulers, at least on the Swahili coast. It's basically broken down into different city states, and merchants are powerful, and then each city state also has its own ruler and own ruling class, and they are the ones who tend to practice Islam, and that's because it helps foster their relationships with the rulers of other Muslim states and with the traders from those states too. And it's a similar thing in Mali as well, but actually the majority of the population in these communities, and as far as Mali is concerned, in the empire, maintain their traditional belief systems, which again the foundation of which is the ancestors taking part in rituals and community rituals and personal rituals that remember and venerate the ancestors. And even in Mali, the emperor, who is nominally Muslim and practices Muslim and tries to remain the emperors try to remain pious Muslims, there is, as it were, pressure on them to still be practicing these old traditional beliefs. I mean, We have even in Mali in the sort of mid 14th century, the 30s, the very famous Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta and chronicler goes to Mali there, and one of the things he mentions is that they have this practice, which actually they still have today, of this hereditary class of storytellers called griots, whose job it is to remember, record, and also recount the history. And they usually are in the service of the nobility, and there's also a family of these griots who are in service to the emperor. And, one of the things that they do is that in certain ceremonies and rituals, they will recount the deeds and the achievements of that emperor's ancestors. So again, it's that remembering and that veneration of the ancestors, very specific thing. And Batuta says that, when he goes there, he says, I was told that this is a very old practice amongst them. It even predates Islam. So they did it before Islam, they do it whilst Islam was there, and they continue to do it today. So that is really the foundational tenets of African religion generally, even when you have the influence and the growth of world religions, what we call the world religions, throughout the centuries.
And I really like that steeping in tradition and crossing over with oral history, because it definitely makes these empires, I think, appreciate, and you can see it with Mansa Musa, with Mali, the appreciation of the past. But then Mansa Musa, I don't think we can go much further in a conversation without talking about Musa, because he's just so awesome, and you seem to have this deep admiration for him throughout the book.
So Musa's an absolute crowd pleaser for sure. So he's the emperor of Mali in the early 14th century. I mean, he's born probably in about the 1280s, maybe 1290. We're not quite sure. And he becomes emperor in the mid sort of 13, maybe around 1305 or 1310. And he comes to the throne actually essentially by accident. His father Abu Bakr tries to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. He sends, one expedition where only one boat comes back. And then when he hears the story about the captain, who says that all the other ships drowned in this whirlpool, he decides to send and lead another expedition of 3,000 ships, all filled with gold and victuals. So he goes with them, he leads them, and he's essentially never seen again after having made Musa regent. So then Musa inherits the empire, loses interest in the sea, and decides that any glory that he gains is going to be through the promotion of himself and the promotion of his empire. So this is around 1310 that he becomes emperor, and he inherits this massive and hugely wealthy empire. It relies on gold. Around a little bit later, but there's one mine in the Mali Empire which is producing around 50% of the world's gold supply. It's a huge, really important resource of gold, but also copper is important, and salt is really important, and it has a population of 50 million people. So Musa inherits this empire in the 1310s, and he becomes intensely interested in it. Now, we know of Musa historically, and he's known to be and reckoned to be probably the most famous and to an extent the most powerful of African leaders, but also probably of world leaders, because of this spectacular pilgrimage that he undertakes in the early 1320s. So Mansa, he's known as Mansa Musa. Mansa is basically the word in the Mali Empire. It's the Mandingo people who live there. So their word for emperor is Mansa. And the rulers of Mali had been Muslim since the incarnation of the empire in the 11th, 12th centuries. So it's remarkably early. And one of the things that a good Muslim has to do is make this pilgrimage to Mecca. But actually, Musa's his genesis for ending up in Mecca, the reason why he ends up there initially actually is because we are told, although we don't know how, is that he accidentally kills so there's no details about this, not many more details about this tantalizing a bit of history. And when he does that, when he accidentally kills his mother, and he's extremely remorseful, he asks his imams, the Muslim priests, for advice on what he should do, and they basically tell him you have to go to the city of Medina in what's now Saudi Arabia and pray at the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad for Allah's forgiveness. And Medina is right next to Mecca. It's really, really close to Mecca, both in modern day Saudi Arabia. So Musa decides that if he's going to go to Medina and rid himself of this remorse for having killed his mother, then he's also going to go to Mecca as well in order to accomplish his pilgrimage. But then he decides that the journey will also be a great opportunity to demonstrate the wealth and the prestige and the power and the glory of the empire, but also of himself. So he decides to go all out for this pilgrimage. He recruits 60,000 Mali citizens to join him, and he also commissions 100 camels as well to be laden with gold. Each camel is laden with 100 kilograms worth of gold, and each subject is wearing silk and carrying gold bars and gold scepters. And they journey 5,000 miles from what's now southwestern Mali, the country, all the way to they go through. They go across the Sahara and up to Libya, to Egypt, and they end up in Saudi Arabia. And everywhere that the train, the pilgrimage stops on a Friday, Musa orders that a mosque be built. And through every town that they pass, they basically overawe the citizens. And actually, there's one incident when they're in Cairo and they're camped, or just before they get to Cairo, and they stay in Giza and they're camped outside. And the Mamluk officials who rule Egypt at that time, this is in about the early 1320s. And they basically think that, they hear about this huge mass of people camped outside the Pyramid of Giza, and they think that it's an invading army. So there's actually an expeditionary force that's sent out to find out what's going on. And when one of the officials who's part of this force sees the Malian camp and sees the 60,000 people, he says, literally, and I quote, in all my life, I've never seen anything like this. And this caravan competes in glittering glory with the African sun itself. So that's the kind of that's the kind of power, that's the kind of sway, that's the kind of wealth that Musa has and Musa demonstrates. Move through Cairo, and again, he demonstrates it by when he gets to Cairo, and he after meeting with the with the Sultan, he and his people basically are allowed to stay in the city, and they're souvenir shopping, and then also Musa is gifting tons of just literally raw gold to the Mamluk officials, and as well as him giving the gold, and the Malians who are in the Cairo markets, buying all kinds of amazing Mamluk goods from ironware to glassware, etc. Musa ends up gifting so much money, and the Malians end up spending so much money in gold that it floods the Egyptian economy and reduces the value drastically of gold, and the price of everything shoots up. And the Mamluk officials basically have to beg Musa to borrow all the gold back in order to stabilize the economy again. So that's on his way to Medina and Saudi Arabia. And actually, when he borrows back all the gold, and then when he gets back to Mali as well, he pays back all the debts that he owes the Cairene merchants, and then again gold floods the economy, and it reduces its value drastically, and all the prices shoot up. And this lasts for at least a decade. There's a chronicler who goes to Cairo in the 30s, and he says that the value of the gold coin is actually reduced, and this has been the case for about 10 years because of the huge amount of wealth that Musa and the Malians spent there. And this affects not only the gold market of Egypt, but actually of Africa more generally, and also of Asia and of Europe, especially the Mediterranean and even Western Europe, because they're all connected. So he's one individual who was so wealthy that he could crash, stabilize, and crash again within the space of 10 to 15 years, one of the most significant economies in the world, and actually continental economies. And, it's just one of the reasons why he's so well remembered. But, again, he wasn't the only impressive or wealthy Malian emperor. He was just the one who ended up deciding to engage in this project. And it's funny because his brother, who inherits the throne afterwards, Musa dies in 1337. Son, actually, called Maga, rules for a little bit, and then he's possibly deposed by Musa's younger brother called Suleiman. And Suleiman has the complete opposite attitude. He's very, very miserly. In fact, that famous Moroccan chronicler and traveler Ibn Battuta actually meets Suleiman in Mali, and he talks about how miserly he is. And one of the reasons for that may be that he was basically he completely disagreed with what Musa had done. But Battuta still describes Suleiman's wealth. He still talks about him having gold quivers and bows and lances of gold and silver. and crystal maces and all this kind of thing. So the wealth of Mali was still very much there, but it only becomes known to the world because of Musa's expedition, basically because of his ambition. And, while Musa is in Medina and in Mecca, he recruits some of the best Muslim scholars and academics in the world, and he brings them back to this town, Timbuktu, which had been conquered while he'd been away on his pilgrimage by his top general Saran Mandian. And he decides there that he's going to found some kind of academic and cultural institution. And in doing so, he puts these scholars that he'd recruited to work. And in doing so, he founds one of the first universities in the world, Timbuktu, which is turning out world-class engineers and lawyers, astronomers, etc. And they have exchange programs with academic institutions across the Muslim world. And by the time Musa dies, the university has 25,000 students and has a library of 1 million manuscripts. And scholars are beginning to produce manuscripts of their own, as well as importing huge amounts of books. And it's a place that scholars from universities across and cultural institutions across the Muslim world want to go, because it's seen as being one of the best places to learn and to advance your career. So that's sort of that demonstrating the wealth of Mali, as well as the founding of the university, is the positive sides of Musa's legacy. But the other side of it is that after he dies, especially, stories start to flow through North Africa, the Mediterranean, and into Western Europe, of this phenomenally wealthy empire or society in West Africa. The French King Charles V in the 1370s commissions this map called the Catalan Atlas, which is made by this Spanish map maker Abraham Cresques, and on which Cresques puts Musa, Mali, and Timbuktu, and he describes Musa as the richest and noblest king in all the land. But this is a demonstration of knowledge and stories of Musa's wealth filtering through to the rest of Western Europe. And that's when you start to see in the 1380s, beginning probably as early as the 1380s, although these don't succeed, some of the first Western European voyages to West Africa, down across, down to where the Atlantic is, around the Gulf of Guinea, in order to find Mali. And so that's the other side of Musa's legacy, is that he ushers in, or is partly responsible for ushering in this contact, which culminates in the colonial history. But it starts off with this huge demonstration of wealth. So he's an endlessly fascinating figure, and people are interested in learning more about Musa, his story, and the pilgrimage. I've done this podcast, Empire of God, which is a spin-off series of This Is History with Dan Jones. So it's called This Is History, Empire of God. And there I tell Musa's complete story. I even theorize about how he might have killed his mother. And I talk about some other lesser-known incidents of his journey, from, the dangers of the desert crossing to encountering other Muslim pilgrims in Medina and Mecca, and also the kinds of rituals that Musa himself would have engaged in. But yeah, he becomes just this giant of African history because of his ambition, essentially.
It just every time I've read or heard his story, and just listening to you then, he just sounds incredible. And to have that amount of influence, not only on his own empire, on other cities in his sphere, but the world economy at that point, is just incredible. But then you were mentioning a couple of points there that I really wanted to tug on. You're mentioning his power as an emperor, as the Mansa, but then throughout the book you also talk about the role of women throughout African kingdoms, and how important they are to the execution of power, and the empire, the emperor's own execution of their power. What is their role in some of the different kingdoms and empires, and just how important are some of these women to dictating world events?
Yes. So from what I understand, actually, my research, and this is sort of throughout time, because you have important female political figures, for instance, in ancient Sudan and the civilization, or the society known as Kush or Nubia, which existed from about 5000 BC to about 300 AD in what's now northern Sudan, southern Egypt. And you have it also, for instance, in 19th century Ashanti, of what's now Ghana. And it seems that in these societies, especially when it came to government power, politics, women often acted as an important counterbalancing force to their male counterparts. In these societies, both in Nubia and in and in Ashanti, you would have a king, but they wouldn't rule absolutely or alone. They would often have, a female counterpart who ruled alongside them. Usually, this would be their mother, known as. They would have an official position called the Queen Mother, and this was actually the most important role in the kingdom. So actually, they were the supreme authority. The Queen Mother, the King's mother, was actually the supreme authority in the kingdom, even more powerful than the king in Ashanti, for example. So the Queen Mother is the only figure in the kingdom who can talk and act against the king. And it was actually a similar thing in Nubia as well. And usually these figures would have their own courts, their own cabinets, usually made up of women themselves. And they were mostly responsible for looking after women's interests and making sure that women's interests were treated fairly and heard fairly. So, for example, in Ashanti, 19th century Ashanti, if it was a case of domestic assault or adultery or sexual assault, it wouldn't just be the king and the king's court who would hear these cases. In fact, sometimes these cases would often go to the women's court first, and then there might be an instance where they're also heard in the king's court, and then there might be a dialogue between them. But the point is that, the Queen Mother had an outsized influence in cases like this, and she also presided over female fertility rituals and initiation rituals and that kind of thing too. So it was about making sure that all areas and all aspects of society were properly taken care of, and that one aspect of society wasn't advantaged to the expense of the other. And then what's interesting in Nubia is that actually, even though from very, very early on you had this important female presence, especially when it was in religious context, and obviously especially in the ancient world and in ancient Nubia, religion and politics were completely intertwined. I mean, they still are so to a great extent. The queen, or female royal women, essentially, this would be the king's sisters or his mother, would have an important role when it came to rituals, and when it came to enhancing the king's relationship with the gods, and then obviously also his legitimacy. So they were often in temple context or ritual context. They would have important roles like playing certain instruments. Like there's a rattle-like instrument called the sistrum, which they'd play, and also they might do something like pouring libations. And this is all part of enhancing the king's legitimacy. But it's something that women have. It's something that is women's role. So they're again involved in that structure, in that dynamic, and in that dialogue between him and the gods, and and as far as his personal and political power is concerned. So women were always important. In fact, in around in one Nubian kingdom called Napta, which exists from about 800 BC to 300 BC, you had a situation where the king literally couldn't come to the throne without the approval of the Queen Mother. So what happened is that then, at that point in Nubian society, kingship was elective. So when a former king died, there would be an election held amongst all these other eligible male candidates, and the person who was chosen, and they were usually chosen by high-ranking officials, generals, politicians, etc. The person who was chosen, and also the previous Queen Mother as well, but the person who was chosen, their mother would become the Queen Mother. And then when it came to actually inheriting the throne, the newly elected prince, the one who's about to become king, would do this tour of these temples of Amun, a really important Egyptian and Nubian god, around his kingdom. And everywhere he went, the Queen Mother would also follow him, and she would basically give a speech in which she asked Amun to approve her son as the next king. And he wouldn't be able to be the next king unless this ritual by the new Queen Mother was performed as well. And then there were also, again, similar to, what happened throughout Nubian society, but also in ancient Nubian society, is that the king's mother and then the king's sister would perform other rituals like, playing instruments and libations, etc., again, to enhance his legitimacy and to improve his relationship with the gods. So you have that very intimate relationship between members of both sexes in these African societies, and they basically act as these, they just act as one part of an entire rulership, an entire rulership system, as it were. And then later on in Nubian society, beginning around the turn of the millennium, you basically have women in Kush and in Nubia who come to rule independently. They will rule with, a king, usually maybe like their husband or their young son, but they are considered the rulers of the kingdom for whatever reason, either being seen as more competent or because their sons, haven't come of age or whatever it is. And they are known as the Kandanke, which is, these sort of queen mothers, like they're queen mothers, but then they're also the actual rulers of the kingdom. So they go to war, they have a say in everything in government, etc. And then actually some of the Kandankes also hold this title in Nubian society called Kore, which literally means ruler. So there are some of these queen mothers, some of these figures, royal women in Nubia, who are literally called not just the queen mothers, i.e. having that role as the supreme authority, but there's some kind of a male in the mix, either as a king, there's some kind of king in the mix, either their son or their husband, but they're actually ruling the kingdom independently. So you can have this complete power shift as well. But more generally, it's just to do with making sure that everybody's, everybody in society gets a say in government and basically has a share in power. And that's where having women in government and in the political sphere is incredibly important, especially in African societies.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. My mum would have quite appreciated that as well. Yeah. But I really like how you're discussing, different kingdoms that we don't necessarily touch on. Kush, Nubia, Kerma, Mali, they're all incredibly important kingdoms within this history, and decentralizing away from a stereotypical image of Egypt. Why did you think it was so important to cover all of these different kingdoms away from the big hitters that people might traditionally think of?
I think with the time span that I selected for the book, this 500,000 years, and also with the different examples that I'd selected, places which people hadn't heard of, I just really wanted to get across that sense of the depth and the richness, the diversity and the variety of African peoples, of our histories, of our cultures, of our achievements, our accomplishments, our important, our figures, our heroes, our villains, our practices, our beliefs. So I wanted to draw from as much as I could, as wide as I could, both in time and in space, in order to just get that across. That there's just so much that we don't know and so much we don't think about, and that was one of the crucial reasons, especially for selecting things which I thought might be less well known to people, because it demonstrates that there's just it's even from what we do know. So there's a lot of people have heard about Mansa Musa Mali, but there'd be a lot within that they don't know of, let alone something that they've not come across at all. And also just to make clear, make the point clear that there is so much left to explore and so much left to talk about. Even this just represents, a fraction of the information, of the stories, of the history, of the accomplishments that exist. And again, just to get us away from that, not to get us away from necessarily, but just to show that yes, although it is important that we talk about the last 300 years of slavery and colonialism, there's all this other stuff that we need to fill out as well, rather than just digging down into so much in excess detail of the last 300 years. We're sort of focused on the last 300 years, digging down into detail, drawing out, there's really interesting scholarship and arguments and debates, etc., to be had, but we're leaving behind the huge bulk of information that would actually give us, it's fascinating in its own right, but actually might give us really important context, even when it comes to learning about the last 300 years, but more importantly, greater context for what it means, in terms of understanding African peoples, our societies and our cultures.
I think it's really important to cover those gaps and remember that it's not a homogenous place. It's not a country on its own. And one way, and it was probably my favourite part actually, the way that you discuss that through language, because quite often there is just a consensus that maybe in Europe that French is just French and everyone in France speaks French, and there's so many different versions. Is it how many different types of languages are going off in Africa, and where are they coming from? Because it was such an interesting way of looking at history.
Yes, probably close to about 2,000. About a third of the world's languages close to a third of the world's languages are spoken in Africa. And I think that goes again to an important point with regards to diversity, difference. Like you said, we often think of, certain countries in Europe as being ethnically and linguistically and culturally homogenous, although we know even then there's a great deal of mixing, migration, difference and diversity. Even, for example, when it comes to, let's say, the UK, we talk about the influence on the North, the Scandinavian influence, for example, and then you talk about the South, where there's a much more French influence, maybe, or a Norman influence, and how much that's changed and how that actually affects the characters of people in the different parts of this country, which is a relatively small one, but even within that, still there's this huge diversity. And it's the thing in Africa, there are things that connect, lots of Africans. Like I said, community is important in a lot of cases. Ancestral veneration is important in a lot of cases. Oral history is important in a lot of cases. The intersection of myth and history is important in a lot of cases, although the ways in which African peoples do those specific things, it does change, and there's a huge amount of diversity in that. And there is just a huge amount of diversity in African peoples in general. And part of the reason for that is because Africa is the longest or the oldest inhabited continent by our species, by Homo sapiens. There has just been a huge amount of evolution, development, basically because of climate or environment, or mixing with different peoples, migration, so different peoples who inhabited different parts of Africa at different times, who then developed different traits, then meeting and mixing with each other, creating new groups that then went on to migrate and mix with other groups. And that's happening over millions of years. I mean, as far as our species is concerned, over a couple 100,000 years, but our earliest ancestor, Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is reckoned to be Sahelanthropus chadensis, Sahel man of Chad, lived 7 million years ago. So from that beginning point, from 7 million years, that amount of movement, change, migration, mixing has just led to an exponential increase in diversity across the continent. And it's the African peoples today who are kind of the inheritors of that. So even though you would have languages, for instance, that might have a similar root because of the different peoples that the ancestors of those different peoples who speak a sort of related language have interacted with, you'll find that the languages that they've ended up with are really, really different. And then also there's been the more recent migration. So for example, it's like a lot of African languages have an Austronesian, or there are some African languages that have an Austronesian origin, and obviously there are a lot that have a European origin. And there are also a lot of African languages that have taken elements from the languages of peoples who no longer exist, especially hunter-gatherers that inhabited most of the continent up until maybe the last 2,000 years, 1,000 to 2,000 years, and that all goes to increase the ethnic, cultural, and even skin color and racial diversity, social and cultural as well, of African peoples. And we'll often think about, and I think this is where it can sometimes be, there needs, or at least I've interrogated the use of the word black in describing African peoples, because even that, which is a term which denotes and is related to skin color, even within Africa itself, there's a huge amount of skin color diversity. I mean, let's say the Khoisan of hunter-gatherers of southern Eastern Africa, for instance, are actually more, sort of yellowish, actually like sort of quite light-skinned in comparison, for example, to the Nigerians or the Ghanaians or the Cameroonians. And even within that, there's a lot of diversity. So I think it was getting away from that homogeneity and saying that actually there's a huge amount of even, racial, ethnic, and skin color difference. So we can't use one term, especially one related simply to skin color, to describe a whole swathe of African people, as we often, might do, especially in Western contexts. And when it comes to Africans who live in Europe, Africans in the diaspora. But so, and acknowledging that difference and diversity, as well as also trying to think of the things that make African peoples more generally, their own thing, distinct and unique from every other people's, either continentally or nationally.
I think that's a really nice way to break down misconceptions that people have about different African cultures, different African languages, and ways of life as well. Because too many times, we have to break down those misconceptions and teach people a proper history. But now I think I have a final fun question for you, Luke, as we do for all guests on the podcast. You make a lot of cultural references in this book. You talk about Chadwick Boseman, Simone Biles. But I wanted to ask you, having mentioned all these different movies and music, did you have a favorite guilty pleasure to switch off whilst you were writing this book?
Yes, I mean, yes, I did. Obviously, as a big, as a writer, and I'm also a big, reader as well. I often read mystery novels, especially Japanese crime novels, to kind of wind down. But in terms of actual guilty pleasures, I'm a bit of a gamer myself. I especially love Nintendo, so I often, whack that on if I was getting really overheated by thinking about something really, really, a little bit complex, or that had a lot of information that I had to break down, and that would be my favorite, just jamming with some Mario Kart or something, or Legend of Zelda, just to completely wind down, and also to spark my imagination and my creativity too. So that was that, as well as reading, like a little bit of fiction that I was interested in, is often what I do.
Yeah, I think they're solid choices.
Yeah.
Did you ever a preferred character in Mario Kart?
Yeah, who was I usually? I think recently I quite like Dry Bowser. This is quite good, but he's quite big. So I usually like small and sneaky characters, so like Koopa. I'd obviously go for Koopa, both in Mario Kart and in Mario Party as well. But it's funny because he's just such like a generic, because he's like a villain. He's just kind of like a generic guy, whereas Dry Bowser is like a little bit more interesting. But he's the perfect size for me. I like something a little bit more nimble. But I don't know if you have, if you yourself play too. I don't know if you have one.
I was more of a dry bones.
Oh yeah, okay. So the dry, well, there's a great similarity there between what we have. So
That's lovely, Luke. Now, if people want to grab, like, because obviously we've left so much on the table, if they want to go and grab a copy of Motherland, where can they go?
Yep, so it's any bookshop, Waterstones, as well for oils. It's also online, on Amazon, and you can also buy it from from booksellers online like WH Smith and Waterstones as well. And then obviously the audiobook is on Amazon as well, read by yours truly. So yes, please, I hope that you pick it up and you enjoy it and you learn something new and also find the stories fascinating or intriguing.
And then obviously people are going to want to go away, interact with you, follow you as well. So where can they go?
Best is my Instagram, which is just my name, Luke Pepera. So at Luke Pepera. So find me there, and I'm usually posting, what I'm up to behind the scenes and also upcoming events and stuff like that. So yeah, check me out on Instagram.
Awesome. And I totally recommend following him and grabbing a copy of the book because it is awesome. But thank you very much, Luke.
No, thank you, Jackson. This has been so fun. So time has flown by. Thank you for having me.
At Gloucester History Festival.
Beams and the Blackfriars were donated by Henry III. And
I mean, there's so much great stuff that goes on here. If anyone's not been to Gloucester History Festival,
The Gloucester History Festival special series on history with Jackson.